The sign was simple, almost shy about what it promised. A red circle stenciled on a white board, hammered into a Normandy verge still clawed by shell bursts and torn fence wire. Drivers called it the ball. Military police waved trucks through with practiced economy, palms flashing, batons indicating the lane that was not merely a road but a decision. In late August 1944, as Allied armies burst out of the hedgerows and started racing east, that red circle marked the entrance to a system that would decide whether momentum could be converted into victory. The name that stuck was casual and urgent, at once the Red Ball Express, and the definition is best kept crisp. It was a priority highway loop, enforced at gun-waving, whistle-blowing, regulation-writing scale, designed to move fuel, ammunition, rations, and spares from coastal depots to forward dumps faster than railways could be repaired and pipelines could be laid. It ran around the clock. It used dedicated traffic control, one-way routing, and an army of mechanics and clerks and cooks, but above all it ran on drivers who learned to steer fatigue into a kind of narrow, forward-leaning focus. It was an emergency bridge, thrown across a gap carved by success itself. That gap began with distance. When the landings gained a foothold in June, and the breakout finally came with thunder in late July, the map began to change shape faster than the logistics could redraw it. Depots clustered near Cherbourg, and the Normandy beaches were overflowing with 5-gallon jerrycans and wooden crates of artillery shells, but the armoured columns and infantry divisions were crossing rivers on the run and arcing toward Paris with appetites no staff study had quite predicted. Railroads were the natural arteries of Europe, but they had been smashed by months of Allied bombing, and even when rails existed, they needed locomotives, crews, and time. Pipelines were an engineer's answer to the tyranny of tonnage. But pipes require trenching, and pumps and valves, and a relative quiet that the first wild weeks of pursuit could not offer. So the problem was not abstract. It lived in the hard physics of a tank's miles per gallon, and in the relentless arithmetic of artillery expenditure. The solution, too, had to be physical and immediate. That is what the Red Ball Express was. A deliberately artificial, ruthlessly managed highway organism that existed only to transform stacked supplies into battlefield tempo. It is important to be precise about what it was not. It was not every convoy in France, not a romantic nickname for any column of canvas-topped trucks rolling past a village clock tower at midnight. It was not a Patton-only lifeline, though Patton's Third Army drew deeply from it, and the public memory often conflates priority with proprietorship. It was not a permanent institution with fixed doctrine, though it borrowed from American freight habits and military police traffic science that predated the war. It was not a magic wand that dissolved friction. Tires blew, bridges choked, and rain turned verges to traps. But where it worked, it did so by narrowing choices. A driver on the Red Ball did not decide his route, any more than a bead of mercury decides the capillary it will follow. He was guided by the red circle signs and the white-gloved hands of MPs trained to keep the loop flowing. He would load at night and drive before dawn, or drive through dusk and unload in a field where ordnance men ticked off cases and a cook kept coffee in battered urns. He would turn around fast, and if his axle complained, a maintenance team would rob a part from a deadlined truck at a roadside graveyard and send him back into the stream. The name itself came from American railroads, where a red ball painted on freight schedules meant high priority. The notion folded neatly into an army that thought in schedules and timetables and told men that time was a weapon. The Red Ball Express opened formally in late August 1944 and peaked in September. It drew on thousands of vehicles, most of them the now iconic 2.5-ton trucks whose rounded fenders and split windshields make them look, in photographs, like beasts built to gnaw distance. Each could carry a few tons, which sounds small until multiplied by the number of trucks, the number of trips per day, and the distance saved by one-way routing that forbid dithering and kept the line taut. The loop ran inland from the beachhead depots, swung along a spine of roadways guarded by MPs, and ended in forward dumps where the cargo vanished into the mouths of engines and the breeches of guns. Then the drivers hustled back on a different road, empty and fast, because the loop had to breathe in and out. They drove with cat's eye reflectors to mark the lanes. They drove blacked out when German aircraft or prudence demanded. They drove knowing that the quiet between towns could be shattered by a loose tire tread or a sudden shadow on a culvert. If a single sentence captures the system's character, it is this: Red Ball existed to turn American industrial depth into operational velocity before the enemy could harden a new line. The German staff, masters of the well-timed counterstroke, understood that momentum is perishable and that pursuit can overextend itself and break like a wave on a sandbar. They mocked the traffic jams in American newsreels and wartime cartoons, the endless lines of trucks struggling up a village hill. But mockery is a brittle armor against results. What mattered was not the elegance of the roads, but the fact that they carried gasoline to tanks that needed to move far enough, fast enough, to keep German divisions from knitting broken frontage into a fabric strong enough to resist. That is why defining the Red Ball Express accurately is not pedantry. The subject attracts romance and exaggeration because there is something poetically stubborn about trucks groping through Normandy fog and Paris glare to feed a front that eats as it fights. Yet the story improves when told plainly. There were dispatchers and load plans and maintenance rosters. There were arguments at staff tables about priorities. There were drivers who learned to breathe with the speed of the convoy and to memorize the peculiar hum of their engine when it was healthy. The discipline, not the decorations, is the hero of the definition. The entire contrivance was temporary by design. No army can afford to keep so much capacity tied to rubber and gasoline when rail lines can be mended and pipelines pressed forward. That temporariness is part of the definition too, because it reveals the Red Ball Express as a hinge rather than a foundation. Hinges are judged by what they let swing open. In the weeks after Paris, the Allied hinge allowed crossings and encirclements that compounded pressure and added miles to daily situation maps. The loop did not conquer, it enabled. It did not end arguments about strategy. It made options real long enough for strategy to be tested by friction rather than by shortage. To call the Red Ball Express a triumph is to risk turning the drivers and dispatchers into mythic figures who tamed chaos by force of will. They were not mythic. They were tired and often uncelebrated, and they did the kind of work that disappears into success. They were, in a precise sense, the definition of logistics, the conversion of the possible into the actual at scale on time. So begin with that sign. It is modest and blunt, and it declares a rule. This way, no dawdling, no second thoughts. Move. Everything that followed the gauntlet of white gloves and batons, the hot stench of gasoline under canvas, the endless sequence of hedgerows and villages and wide French skies, was an effect of that rule. What the Red Ball Express was is best understood in terms of rules made to bend reality, and what it was not is anything that lives only in nostalgia. It was a machine to carry mass, organized so that speed would not shred it. It lasted just long enough to change the shape of the fight. Dates matter because they anchor memory to terrain. The clock for this story starts in the closing days of August 1944, when the euphoria of breakout collides with the logistics of pursuit. Paris is liberated on the 25th, and the Allied command inherits a geography reshaped by victory. The ports behind the front are crowded and alive, yet they sit far from the armoured spearheads that are pushing east with an appetite measured in gallons per mile. The Red Ball Express begins as a specific answer at a specific moment. It is formally activated as a priority road loop at the end of August, and surges into September, the month when the distance between rear and front grows fastest, and commanders feel the difference between intent and capability. By November, as rail lines are mended and ports are brought fully online, the tempo eases and the loop's necessity fades. That arc, late August ignition, September blaze, November taper places the express within a season, as bounded and consequential as a campaign ribbon. Routes matter because they tell you where stress will collect. The spine of the system runs from beaches and depots clustered around Cherbourg and the Normandy lodgement, across country now cleared of the worst hedgerow obstacles, toward the Paris basin, and beyond it toward forward dumps near Chartres and Reims. The geometry is practical. A one-way path inland and a separate one-way return route minimize head-on encounters and human indecision. Military police enforce spacing and pace, using hand signals by day and cat's eye markers and torches by night, to turn roads that were never designed for such traffic into a kind of human-made conveyor belt. Bridges are measured not just for weight limits but for how they bend under convoys that arrive like pulses from a beating heart. Vehicles matter because they impose their own laws. The 2.5-ton truck is the Teentroke, workhorse, recognizable in photos by its purposeful stance and by the way men lean against it as if against a companion. Under the hood is enough power to haul a few tons at a steady clip, a capacity that seems small until multiplied by the number of trucks and the frequency of turnarounds. There are trailers, too, bouncing behind like stubborn nephews, and lighter trucks that dart in the shadows of the big ones. Each vehicle has a personality expressed through its maintenance log. Each bears the scar of a hurried repair, a cannibalized part, a replaced tire that cost someone a fingernail. The convoy becomes a living thing composed of such compromises, and its health is not measured in the perfection of any one truck, but in whether the whole line keeps time with the need at the front. People matter because boxes do not move themselves. A striking share of the drivers are black soldiers serving in segregated units, assigned to labor that many of their countrymen do not consider glamorous or even honorable, and yet shouldered with a responsibility that admits no failure. They drive long hours with little sleep, they learn the quirks of French weather and French roads, and they become the face of a system that is supposed to be invisible when it works well. Their presence and performance write a sentence that the army, and the nation behind it, will take years to read fully. They are joined by dispatchers who speak the language of clipboards and ration charts, mechanics who live with grease ground into their hands, cooks who keep coffee hot because hot coffee can be a kind of fuel, and MPs who carry whistles and batons like a conductor's wand and a judge's gavel combined. Cargo matters because it has a voice. Gasoline sloshes in jerrycans that thud and thrum with the rhythm of potholes. Ammunition speaks in its own grammar. Small arms in light crates, artillery shells in heavy ones that strain the backs of men unloading into forward dumps where ordnance officers tick off numbers against priorities set far behind the line. Rations are less dramatic but just as relentless, because an army marches on its stomach, and an army that runs also eats like a wolf. Spares matter, too, because the cost of stopping a tank at the wrong place is counted not just in lost miles but in lives. The Red Ball Express is not a generalized supply pool. It is tuned to the things that convert into movement and combat power most directly. Tempo matters because it is the difference between a story about trucks and a story about war. Around-the-clock operations are not a rhetorical flourish. They are a demand that renders daylight and darkness into different flavors of the same work. Night brings its own risks, from blacked-out driving to fatigue that plays tricks. But night is also time recovered from the calendar, and the system is built to recover time ruthlessly. Turnaround speed at depots and forward dumps becomes a moral test. A truck that sits for an extra hour is not just late, it is a subtraction from the front's options tomorrow morning. The language of the loop is not poetic, but the effect is. Every minute shaved from a loading drill or a traffic jam does not remain a minute. It compounds into momentum measured in miles. Scale matters because it keeps pride honest. Numbers can be tossed about to impress, but the more instructive way to feel the scale is to think in layers. Imagine a line of trucks long enough to actually change the sound of a village day, running from the sea through hedgerows and into the flat country where the eye can finally see distance. Stack that line with loads that whisper gasoline and grunt iron. Place along its margins the teams that keep it alive. Now let it breathe in and out, day and night, like a lung. The figure you arrive at how many tons delivered becomes less an attempt to win an argument and more a portrait of a system that refuses to let distance reclaim what combat has just bought. Limits matter, because honesty breeds trust. The Red Ball Express did not solve every problem, and it did not make debate among commanders evaporate. There were moments when columns paused, not for lack of courage but for lack of fuel. There were arguments about whether to concentrate resources for a decisive lunge or to feed a broader front. There were days when weather mocked plans and when a single damaged bridge snarled a whole sector. There were also temptations to use the loop for anything and everything, to turn priority into a slogan rather than a discipline. The best measure of the system's maturity is how often it said no in order to preserve the yes that mattered. Finally, purpose matters because it threads everything together. The Red Ball Express exists to transform industrial potential into operational reality at a moment when victory is up for auction to the best organizer of cause and effect. It is a bridge of weeks, not years, meant to be replaced by quieter machines like railways and pipelines. In that quiet future, the trucks will seem loud and primitive, but in the season they serve, they are precisely what the war requires. Dates, routes, vehicles, people, cargo, tempo, scale, limits, purpose. Consider them the facts that would be printed on a tidy panel if the story were flattened into a card. Here they are allowed to breathe, because facts lived by tired men on dim roads deserve sentences, not just labels. The countryside in late July had the flavor of spent thunder. Operation Cobra, the breakout from the bocage west of St. Lo, arrived like a door kicked from its hinges, and the proof that the door was truly gone lay in what came next. Columns formed not in the cramped grammar of hedgerows, but in long clauses that ran across the page of the map. The geometry of battle changed. Tanks that had struggled for a hedgerow's worth of ground began to eat miles. Infantry who had learned to count victory in fields began to count it in towns. The speed was exhilarating and, for planners with sharpened pencils, vaguely terrifying. Every mile gained was a promise made on behalf of fuel that had not yet been carried. In that last week of July and the first days of August, a pattern took shape. The front expanded its appetite with a young athlete's confidence and little patience for calorie counts. The railways that ought to have fed it were broken in too many places, and the repair crews who knew how to resurrect them were talented but could not be everywhere at once. There is a photograph of a locomotive cratered and tilted like a toy, and it captures the problem's mood rather than its mechanics. The tracks could be replaced, the sleepers reset, the bridges respanned with cautious engineer grace, but none of that happened at the speed of a tank column on an open road. Even a locomotive at full steam cannot run over a bridge that no longer exists. The pipelines were another route to salvation, but a pipe is a patient creature, demanding ditches and pumps and sealing rings and a kind of attention that a headlong pursuit treats as indulgence. The front, meanwhile, burned gasoline as if it were a new kind of courage. The liberation of Paris on August 25th created a fulcrum around which the story now swings. The euphoria of the city had a price in trucks and fuel, because joy also travels. The decision-makers in the communications zone, responsible for turning portside stacks into frontline sustenance, saw Monday mornings in a way the line officers did not. They saw tonnage and traffic patterns, forklift crews and warehouse men, and the long shadow of the next week's needs. The Red Ball Express was born in that light, a morning-minded solution to an afternoon problem. It was inaugurated to provide a high-priority, one-way path for the cargo most directly convertible into forward motion. The military police who enforced its discipline were not traffic cops so much as interpreters of intent. Their white gloves translated theater-level decisions into the unwavering hand signals that kept a truck from hesitating at a fork in the road. September was the month that tested whether the idea could stand up to weather, wear, and human fallibility. The fields were kind when dry and treacherous when they took rain, and the verges that had seemed wide during planning became narrow when a convoy chose them as a rest. Mechanics learned the way the 2.5-ton trucks sulked when they were tired, and the ways to coax them back onto the loop. Tire shortages were not abstract. They were the difference between a vehicle staying in motion and a vehicle contributing only to a heap of spares. The MPs had to become half psychologists, reading the anxiety of a driver whose eyes had not closed properly in 2 days, and the edginess of an officer who wanted a faster line. Dispatchers composed their own music in the loading areas, struggling to keep a rhythm that did not drown out the melody of priority. And somewhere, out near a forward dump, An ordnance team learned to accept that perfect distribution plans melt under the heat of necessity. German officers watching the map add curves and arrows noticed something both predictable and worrying. It was predictable that pursuit would outrun supply lines. This is the oldest lesson of armies that start to taste victory. It was worrying that the pursuit did not stumble as much as it ought to have, that the pauses were shorter than the staff pessimists predicted, that columns starved less dramatically than hunger stories require. The Luftwaffe still existed and could threaten. Anti-vehicle mines, snipers, and ambushes were tools in the German kit. But hunting a convoy is not the same as choking a system. The Red Ball Express was designed to deny the enemy a single throat to squeeze. It was a braid, not a rope. When a section kinked, the rest flexed around it. When a day was lost to weather, the night tried to make amends. That resilience turned the weeks after Paris into a season the Germans experienced as a kind of pressure in the chest. The end of September and the beginning of October introduced a new rhythm. Rail lines patched by engineers began to draw more of the load. Ports groaned but settled into routines. Pipelines extended their quiet reach into the interior. The Red Ball Express still ran, but it was no longer the only melody. It receded from the foreground of the orchestra into a section that could take a phrase and return the theme to others. That was always the plan. The system was a hinge and had served its purpose by letting the door swing. There were still spaces on the map to cross and battles to fight that would test patience and blood and the capacity of every supply system ever devised. But the specific crisis that called the Red Ball into being had been answered by its existence and by the other systems it had bought time to complete. Empty tanks make a useful symbol, but they mislead when they imply helplessness. The true dread of that season was not a dramatic halt in the middle of a highway with captured German infantry staring at Allied armour stranded for lack of gas. The dread was subtler. The steady thinning of a daily schedule until initiative bled out of a plan. The Red Ball Express existed to prevent that anemia. When the loop worked, it injected enough pressure to keep the arteries of the front pulsing. By the time the loop quieted, the patient had grown stronger arteries. That is the time story implicitly told by the weeks from Operation Cobra to the softening of urgency in November. The pace is the message. Breakout, pursuit, hinge, handoff. It reads like a short set of lines in a planner. But each line is composed of men who drove while their eyelids begged, of clerks who learned that numbers could be tasted like metal when the stakes were high, of MPs who lost their voices to whistles and their tempers to stubborn drivers, and of commanders who learned that audacity and administration are not opposites but complements. The Red Ball Express did not so much save the day as allow each day to become a bridge to the next without collapsing. That is how weeks become victories. The first lever is distance. Before breakout, the front and the depots shared a neighbourhood. After Cobra and the dash across France, they shared a continent. Every extra mile lengthened the umbilical cord, and cords do not stretch without thinning. The Red Ball Express shortened effective distance by turning meandering French roads into a taut loop. One-way routing prevented head-on delays and extracted speed from lanes that had never known such single-minded traffic. Distance, in that moment, was not measured on a map but in hours saved, and the loop's choreography shaved those hours as a butcher trims fat with a confident hand. Drivers learned to trust the red circle signs the way sailors trust a beacon. The first lever, then, was a decision to redefine geography through rules. The second lever is throughput. Ports disgorged cargo and railheads held it like reservoirs, but the front drank on a schedule that mocked the idea of business hours. Throughput is not simply volume, it is volume per time, and time is always the crueler denominator. The Express attacked the denominator. Loading teams rehearsed the dance of stacking jerrycans and crating shells so that engines idled less and wheels were rolling more. Dispatchers staggered releases to prevent clots. At forward dumps, ordnance officers learned to receive quickly and push even faster, converting truckloads into availability for units whose day would be decided by what sat in their vehicles at dawn. If intake and outflow were misaligned at either end, the system coughed. When aligned, it purred. The lever was not brute strength but timing. The third lever is fuel burn per mile per division, which reads like an accountant's fetish until you place it beside a tank column that can smell an opportunity over the next ridge. A division is a habit of machines and men that drinks gasoline in ways both predictable and not. Staff officers carried tables that pretended to know the appetite. The Express made those tables reality. Fuel moved in cans because pipelines had not yet been taught to speak to the front. The cans were heavy, noisy, spill-prone, and perfect for the problem that existed right now. They could be stacked high and counted quickly. They did not require the patient engineering romance of a pump station, only the grounded stamina of men with strong backs working in a rhythm honed by repetition. The lever here was accepting that the ideal form of delivery would arrive later, and that the present demanded a tool that traded elegance for immediacy. The fourth lever is road discipline, which sounds like a scolding until you picture a medieval lane asked to behave like a modern highway. Convoys are living organisms. Without discipline they bunch and then stretch. They clog bridges, and then starve stretches of road to their rear. Military police enforced spacing with the crisp gestures of drill masters and with the weary wisdom of traffic wardens who have seen what happens when impatience is allowed to masquerade as initiative. They controlled crossings as if conducting a concerto in which every wrong entrance would sour the next 4 bars. They imposed speed not for romance but for harmony. A convoy that moved too fast in the wrong place was as damaging as one that moved too slow in the right place. The lever worked because MPs owned the psychology of drivers as well as the geometry of roads. The fifth lever is maintenance and spares. The lever least loved in stories because it smells of grease and features no gallant charges. The loop devoured parts. Tires wore faster than supply ships could satisfy. Axles complained. Engines wanted the kind of attention that is difficult to give in muddy verges with rain ticking on canvas. The answer was a culture of cannibalization and triage. A graveyard truck was not a failure, it was a donor. Mechanics adopted the unromantic genius of field medicine, saving what could be saved fast, and sacrificing a few to keep the many moving. Dispatchers learned to account for expected attrition and to build slack into schedules that did not have any slack to spare. The lever worked because the system stopped treating breakdowns as exceptions and began treating them as a budget line. The sixth lever is traffic control and dispatch, the invisible bureaucracy that turns thousands of individual decisions into a single intent. The Red Ball Express did not simply rely on willpower. It relied on sheets of paper, on chalkboards crammed with numbers, on map pins and grease pencils that translated frontline hunger into rear area action. A request for gasoline at a forward dump became ticks on a chart at a depot, 30, 60, or 100 miles away. The men who made those ticks learned to think in waveforms rather than lists. If one wave met a bridge under repair at noon, the next wave had to be timed to hit it after the engineers cleared the obstruction. The lever functioned because dispatchers learned to see the loop not as roads and trucks but as a pulse to be maintained. The seventh lever is driver endurance, the harshest because it cuts close to the core of human limits. Men can be scheduled but not summoned to alertness by decree. The loop addressed this with rotation when possible and with the rough kindness of coffee, hot food, and camaraderie when rotations broke under necessity. Drivers traded tips about patches of road that bit tires and about MPs who could be charmed with a joke into granting mercy at a checkpoint. They learned to measure their own fading and to pull off before the blur behind the eyes became dangerous. Official rest plans existed, but in practice the system survived because individuals learned the honesty of stopping and the courage of admitting fatigue. Leadership, at its best, blessed such honesty rather than punishing it. The lever turned because the culture recognized that a well-timed nap can be as decisive as a fresh set of spark plugs. These levers worked together. Distance was defeated not by speed alone but by discipline that made speed safe. Throughput rose because maintenance prevented a rolling stock collapse just when traffic control found the right tempo. Fuel burn stopped being an abstraction and became a daily covenant, only after dispatchers turned requests into waves that forward dumps could absorb without chaos. Endurance ceased to be a liability, and became an asset when the rhythm of the loop gave men a sense that their exhaustion had meaning and their start times were part of a pattern larger than themselves. The machine did not run because any one part was heroic. It ran because the parts were made to take turns being central, and because failure modes were anticipated rather than discovered in crisis. There is a temptation to crown a single lever king. The romance makes for an easy paragraph. It was the drivers, it was the MPs, it was the dispatcher's mind, it was the deuce and a half itself. The truth resists coronations. The Red Ball Express was an ecology in which predators of delay were hunted by multiple species at once. Discipline stalked impatience. Maintenance stalked entropy. Dispatch stalked confusion. Endurance stalked despair. The result was not perfection. The result was, more often, a grim sufficiency that allowed the front to reach the next bridge intact and the next day with options. That, finally, is what it means to explain the key drivers. It is to show how a system made of rubber, iron, paper, and will turn uncertainty into miles and laughter on the enemy side into a thinner laugh, and then into silence. Authority on paper is a clean diagram, but authority in motion is a negotiation played out between clipboards and engines. The system that kept trucks moving from the beaches and depots to the forward dumps was governed by a set of lanes that looked simple from the distance of a staff briefing and wonderfully complicated from the seat of a cab. The communications zone, which everyone shortened to comms, sat like a quiet powerhouse behind the clamour of the front. Its officers scheduled ships, counted crates, assigned labour battalions to the docks, and issued the orders that told warehouses when to breathe out in sync with the front's inhale. They did not own the fight, but they owned the means by which fighting stayed possible. Facing them across an invisible table were the field armies whose language was opportunity and whose measure of time was how long a bridge could be seized before the enemy reacted. The system worked when these two ways of thinking recognized they needed each other more than they needed to win any particular argument. Requests for supplies began as the most human of things. A unit quartermaster running his pencil down a sheet and writing numbers that meant food and ammunition and, more than anything else in that season, gasoline. Those requests climbed through echelons, gaining a kind of political weight as they went. At some point they crossed into comms's sphere and turned from pleas into tasks. That crossing was not just a signature in a headquarters. It was a moment when the authority to decide what mattered shifted from those who needed things now to those who had to make the now of many units cohere into a tomorrow. The Red Ball Express existed partly to give this transfer of authority a physical instrument. A truck loaded under comms's plan and released onto the loop was a vote cast for a theatre-level priority, and once those wheels were moving, that vote was not easily recounted. Traffic control brought the abstraction down to earth. Military police, trained to see the road as a living thing with moods and temptations, exercised a small local sovereignty on behalf of the larger order. They held the power to stop a driver who wanted to break formation or to wave through a convoy whose timing mattered more than anyone else's convenience. Their authority drew its legitimacy from the decision lanes above them, but they maintained it by earning the grudging respect of men who were tired, late, and convinced that their load was the most important in France. The MP with the white gloves and a whistle often made the difference between the loop behaving like a disciplined artery and degenerating into the kind of traffic that has defeated armies since wagons were first hitched to wars. Within commsy, priorities took shape in meetings that would sound bloodless if their consequences were not so immediate. Officers weighed the gains of pushing gasoline for armor against the security that came from building larger stocks of artillery ammunition. They examined reports from engineers on the status of rail bridges and the repair of track sections, because every section that returned to life took pressure off the loop and allowed the road system to be tuned for speed rather than sheer survival. They asked the unglamorous questions: how many tires are left in the pipeline? How many trained mechanics can be pulled from depot rotations without inviting breakdowns that will echo for weeks? How many cooks and clerks can be spared without starving the back end of the energy that keeps midnight operations humane? When they cut through all the noise, they found themselves returning to a single principle that governed everything else: A system designed to feed momentum cannot be sacrificed to short-term symbolism. A truck diverted for a minor favor was a small act of sabotage. A truck kept to the plan was a promise kept to the line. On the receiving end, at forward dumps only a few dozen miles behind the moving front, ordnance officers translated theatre-level decisions into stacks of crates and columns of numbers on requisition sheets. They did this, surrounded by urgency that carried its own logic. Units showed up with commanders who argued in the grammar of risk, pointing to the ridgeline where tomorrow's fight would ignite, and insisting that the extra fuel or the extra allotment of 105 seconds would mean the difference between forcing a crossing and being forced back. The governance of supply was never a pure chain. It was a braid of intent and improvisation. The discipline here was to keep improvisation from swallowing intent whole. The best officers found a way to listen with sympathy and answer with enough flexibility to keep trust alive, without letting the system dissolve into 1,000 conflicting emergencies. Who decides? Reached even further down, into the intimate space where a driver chose whether to risk pushing an ailing truck another 30 miles, or turn back to the maintenance yard and confess a failure that might strand a load. Governance at this level took the form of culture more than orders. Men were taught that honesty about a failing part was not weakness but respect for the larger machine. Mechanics were empowered to make triage calls that sacrificed one vehicle to save 3, and their decisions were shielded by commanders who understood that second-guessing after the fact was a fine way to create timid choices. This was not sentimental. It was a recognition that authority, to truly govern, must meet the situation at its level of reality, and not merely recite doctrine from a warm office. Back at depots and ports, stevedores and warehouse foremen were folded into the same logic. They were given targets that looked like numbers but behaved like morality. So many tons per hour, so many trucks released before dawn, so many minutes shaved off an average loading time. The supervisors who flourished were those who treated these targets not as cudgels but as games, to be won with pride. They organized crews so that the most experienced hands handled the trickiest loads, and the new men learned without paralyzing the line. They kept coffee hot and tempers cool and made heroes out of teams that found ways to load one more truck before daylight burned off the night's forgiving cool. The coordination cell that synchronized the whole affair resembled a conductor's stand more than a general's tent. It sat in ComZ space but drew a line of sight, through reports and dispatches and field telephone calls, into the forward dumps and the main roads. Grease pencils marked arcs across maps that quickly looked like palimpsests. The old marks barely faded before new ones were layered over them. Here, arguments did not end with someone slamming a fist on the table. They ended with the unlovely elegance of scheduling. This wave will release at 0200. This bridge will be closed until 0515. This detour will cost 20 minutes but save the line, because a bridge inspector spotted something no commander could see from the sky. Governance also required the power to say no. Saying no is the truest test of authority, and the system had to deploy it with care. No. A convoy could not be delayed to carry a general's personal baggage, because that would cost an infantry regiment its hot rations in the morning. No. A set of trucks could not be retasked within sight of the front because their empty return was the oxygen the loop needed to breathe. No. A priority list could not be torn up at midnight because someone's persuasive speech outshone the quiet grind of every truck that had already been promised to a plan. Each no protected a larger yes that mattered more. The art was explaining that no in a way that kept people invested in the system rather than tempted to undermine it. When authority explained itself with clarity and with an honest account of trade-offs, it did not merely order obedience, it earned it. In the end, who decided what came down to the system's ability to turn theatre priorities into a local sense of purpose. A signalman watching cat's eye reflectors wink past his roadside post at 3 a.m. had to feel that his own small jurisdiction mattered to the journey. A cook ladling out coffee at a forwarding point had to believe that a hot drink at the right moment could keep a driver's attention just enough to save a life 3 miles later. A chief of staff poring over tonnage reports had to believe that the numbers were not just abstractions but a language by which lives could be spared tomorrow. The Red Ball Express was governed by orders and offices, but it was also governed by a feeling that the work added up to something clean and necessary. Where that feeling held, decisions made far away did not feel foreign. They felt like the edges of a map that 1,000 hands drew together. If you looked at the enemy's cartoons and propaganda in those weeks, you would see long lines of American trucks drawn as a kind of self-inflicted joke. The jab was easy to deliver. Any army that relies on roads can be made to look slow and clumsy, and the first photographs that emerged of convoys creeping through French villages offered a gift to anyone eager to believe that these supposed masters of industry had trapped themselves in their own supply. In staff rooms behind the lines, officers smirked and pointed to roads that were never meant to carry such weight, and to bridges that looked fragile even when they were new. It is part of a military tradition to take comfort in the enemy's apparent mistakes. But inside the serious memoranda, under the wry marginalia, worry began to harden. The intelligence summaries carried a tone more analytic than amused. They recorded that Allied columns, which were supposed to slow after the initial fury of their breakout, were not obligingly settling into a pace that would allow a neatly calculated counterattack. The maps behind these reports told the story with curved arrows that were too bold for comfort. To the staff minds that prized the crisp counterstroke and the economy of force, the Allied behaviour looked like a refusal to play according to the accepted script. The mocking cartoons had to share space with the observation that the enemy was finding ways to feed movement past the point where logistics traditionally demanded a pause. When attacks went in against the roads, they produced the tactical results expected from the old textbooks. A few trucks burned, traffic backed up, bridges were closed for hours. Men dove for ditches and came up with their ears ringing from strafing runs that still found targets to frighten. Mines and ambushes pricked the roots and made commanders flinch. Yet when staff officers tried to convert these tactical disruptions into operational advantage, the sums did not add to the comfort they sought. The loop bent, but it did not break. The enemy's officers had managed to build something that did not offer a single neck to be strangled. The men who ran the system seemed to accept a background rate of loss the way a ship's captain accepts that the sea will claim some rivets before the voyage is over. What mattered was that the great mass kept moving, and in those weeks it did. This is how worry matures, through a sequence of disappointments that reveal the limits of the easy plan. Interdict the route here. The trucks find a detour no one had thought worth a serious look before. Bomb a bridge. The engineers patch it or reroute traffic with a speed that humiliates the rubble. Hit a convoy at a choke point. The lull that follows is not long enough for a counterattack to bite. Every headquarters has its professional pessimists, and their voices gained timbre as the reports kept coming. The Allies were behaving like men confident that their industrial base could be translated into motion even at the cost of waste, and the staff who had learned to interpret such confidence as bluster could not quite convince themselves that this was all theatre. They recognized in the back of their minds that a nation willing to treat trucks and tires as expendable grenades for the sake of keeping armored divisions fueled was dangerous in a way that did not fit old categories. Among the officers closest to the fighting, the mood was even less receptive to mockery. The practical men who supervised forward units found that the opponents they faced were arriving with the fuel and shells they needed more often than their doctrine predicted. They were meeting the kind of enemy who, when checked at one point, arrived again at another with disconcerting quickness. This did not mean that every American battalion was fat with supplies. There were real shortages, real pauses, and moments when empty tanks were more than a metaphor. But the pattern was wrong for those who wanted to believe that a few smart cuts could starve an opponent's will. The pattern said something else, that the Allies had a resilience built into their supply, a rhythm that soaked up shocks and returned to tempo with a stubbornness that felt like fate when seen from the other side. Capturing a fuel column is the sort of tactical success that can intoxicate a commander for a day and leave him hungover by week's end. There were incidents in which the enemy seized gasoline and celebrated as if they had stolen time itself. but time stolen from a system that can reclaim it is a tricky prize. Reports filtered back that even after a success against a convoy, the expected collapse in enemy mobility did not materialize at scale. The loop absorbed the loss, its dispatchers reshuffled, its drivers did not abandon their cabs, its mechanics worked longer under bad lamps, and by the time a counterattack was ready, the chance to turn a victory into a hinge had passed. The Luftwaffe's share of the problem became a kind of cruel accounting. Fighter bombers and strafing runs made themselves felt. They frayed nerves and set trucks aflame, and sent men diving into culverts where the cold water tasted of rust and weeds. But the air arm struggled to assert a presence sufficient to make the roads more than dangerous. Control of the skies was a conversation in which one voice had become a hoarse whisper. The practical effect was that hours lost to air threat were often recovered by driving in darkness or by slipping through in the cool of dawn. The roads continued to belong, in the arithmetic that mattered, to the convoys. None of this erased the German tradition of exploiting overextension, the grim school that had taught generations of officers to sense the moment when an enemy's arm had reached too far. That tradition remained a live wire in their thinking. It sparked again when they noticed that the Allies argued amongst themselves about how to prioritize resources, whether to mass for a decisive blow or sustain a broad pressure that promised safety without drama. The hope was that politics and caution would combine to create the very gap that attacks had failed to rip open. And yet the quiet power of the Red Ball Express lay in its capacity to narrow the practical difference between these choices. A system that could feed multiple thrusts without collapsing reduced the reward for guessing the enemy's preference correctly, so the tone in the serious papers shifted. The cartoons did not disappear. No army entirely surrenders its need to laugh at the other side, but beneath the laughter, a colder respect formed. Officers wrote about traffic discipline with the kind of admiration that only grudging men can produce. They noted the presence of specialized police on the routes, the careful use of one-way loops, the profusion of signs, the predictability of timetables that suggested a mind behind the movement rather than a mere mass stumbling forward. They observed with a frankness that must have stung that the American habit of throwing material at a problem had been married to a kind of process competence that made the throwing efficient. Mockery gave way to a realization that the roads were not a vulnerability so much as an instrument, and that the instrument was being played with increasing skill. Respect did not equal despair. The staff minds that prized maneuver still looked for places where the enemy would be forced to pause. Winter, rivers, and politics offered events that even convoys could not overrule. But in the late summer and early autumn of 1944, a specific sentiment settled. The enemy had found a way to turn trucks into a strategic sentence, and as long as that sentence was being written each night and day, it would be read on the battlefield the next morning in the form of tanks that could move and guns that could fire. It is sobering to realize that what begins as a joke about traffic can end in quiet alarm. The enemy discovered that lesson one report at a time, until the smirk on the margin of the map became a thin line pressed hard with a pencil. Before the system becomes a set of numbers, it must pass through the hands of men who steer, lift, and wait. The image that endures from those weeks is not a diagram, but a face lit by the dashboard's weak glow, eyes narrowed against the dark. A great portion of those faces belong to black soldiers serving in segregated units, assigned to work that too many in their own army dismissed as mere labor, while entrusting them with the single most unforgiving ingredient of a moving war: time. They learned the curves of roads that were older than the language in which they were commanded. They learned which culverts drained quickly after rain, and which held puddles that would pull at a tire like a slow hand. They learned the smells of gasoline and hot brake metal, and the way fatigue crept up from the spine to the eyes and begged for a bargain that could end in a ditch. Their training was often brief and unimaginative, a fact that makes what they accomplished even more stark. As the loop matured, experience became the truer teacher. A man's first night run educated him in everything that classes had missed. He discovered the rhythm of cat's eye reflectors, winking by like small planets, and the manner in which an MP's hand signal could mean 3 different things, depending on the angle of the wrist and the urgency of the eyes. He learned that the convoy as a whole had a personality that could swing from impatience to caution in the space of a mile. He grew accustomed to the music of the engine that sat before him like a living thing with moods and needs. If the pitch went wrong, he felt it in his ribs before he could name it. There was danger in quiet shapes. A culvert mouth with weeds curtaining the edges could hide a mine. A farmhouse window could become the lip of a rifle. A bridge that looked stout in daylight could, after a day of traffic, start to sound ominous under the tires. The drivers were not infantry, but they learned to read the land with a tactician's attention. Their courage did not have a trumpet, it had a steady thrum. When strafing came, it came in a tearing rush that left dents in the road and smoke in the throat. Men bailed out, hugged ground, and then returned to their cabs because returning was the job. Stories from those runs do not crescendo toward a climactic act. They repeat a chorus. We went back to the wheel. At waypoints and forward dumps, the human texture of the loop thickened. Cooks knew who took coffee black and who wanted sugar when the night got into their bones. Mechanics became priests of a reluctant gospel, laying hands on reluctant carburetors and tired axles and bringing them back long enough to make another turn. Clerks who never saw the front handled the papers that sent men into danger and felt, in their own quiet way, the weight of doing it right. The work was all intertwined. A cook's extra ladle of stew at the end of a shift could stretch a driver's patience just enough to prevent a rash decision later. A clerk's neat penmanship could save a truck from being misrouted into the wrong lane and hours of unnecessary wandering. A mechanic's choice to rob a part from one vehicle instead of another could enable a wave of trucks to release on schedule. Everyone in that ecosystem learned to see their task not as small, but as a piece of a necessary rhythm. The drivers also carried a social burden that the trucks did not. Segregation walked beside them, unquestioned by many and resented by those who bore it. They did the work that made movement possible, and then had to watch others receive the praise that the public knows how to give soldiers who hold rifles rather than steering wheels. In the rare moments when praise did reach them, when an officer wrote a letter upward that called out a company's performance, when a visiting general shook hands and meant it, they held those words with the same care they gave to their route cards. Their pride did not need an audience to be real. It needed only the knowledge, gained with every safe turnaround, that they had made a promise to men who would fight tomorrow morning and had kept it. Fear and exhaustion were kept in a kind of balance by rituals. Men told the same jokes at the same mile markers because the joke's repetition became a kind of amulet. They collected stories about kind French families who kept a kettle near the door and doled out coffee with a generosity that made the language barrier irrelevant. They learned to identify the MPs whose patience was infinite and those whose temper tried to outrun their professionalism. They gave their trucks names that they would never admit to in front of an officer, but used when the engine needed coaxing. They wrote home with details they knew would be censored, leaving out place names and dates and leaving in the weather and the taste of apples and the way the fog comes up in a field at 4 a.m. and sits like a cat. Leadership inside the cab was mostly a compact with the self. A man had to know when to push a little harder and when to admit that his mind had gone hazy enough to turn a pines, straight road into a winding one. Officers who understood this looked for men who could be trusted with the truth. They built schedules with slack, where slack could be spared, and demanded pace where it could not. The best of them walked the line at odd hours and recognized faces, not just ranks. They learned to praise men by name in front of their peers and to reserve scolding for the private space of the cab step. There is an old wisdom that says, an army marches on its stomach. In these weeks, the army also drove on its morale. A single driver's feeling that his effort was seen could be the ounce of attention that kept a truck in the lane instead of drifting into trouble. Every system has its saints and its unrecorded dead. Tire blowouts on a blind curve took lives that looked like footnotes in the larger story. A mechanic misjudged a jack stand and paid the price under a falling axle. A cook on a cold night slipped on a slick patch and broke a hip that would ache for the rest of a long life. These too were casualties of a campaign that historians draw with arrows, but which was lived in shoes and on knees and under trucks where tools fell into the grass and could not be found again until daylight. The drivers did not think of themselves as heroes while they were doing the work. They thought of themselves as men who needed to get from here to there and back, and then from there to here again, until someone told them they could stop. If memory is honest, it will admit that grit is not a posture, but a practice. It is not captured in a single photograph of a man leaning on a fender with oil on his hands. It is captured in the fact that the same man shows up for the night run after the day run, and that he laughs at a small joke told badly, because the laughter loosens something inside and keeps the wheel steady. The Red Ball Express, for all its process and planning, lived and died on this kind of grit. The drivers were the instrument by which ideas became miles. They taught the rest of the system a lesson that could not be written in an order, that the dignity of unglamorous labor can sustain an army's ambition longer than anyone expects, and can do it without asking for more in return than a fair measure of respect and a chance to finish the job. At the heart of the achievement lies arithmetic that refuses glamour and insists on being believed. The simplest way to understand the scale is to build it from the ground up, the way a loading sergeant might explain it to a new driver, too eager to make generalizations. One truck does not win a campaign. One truck, properly loaded, properly dispatched, and properly received, becomes an element in a chain that only matters because it repeats. The miracle, if the word is allowed for something built of sweat and schedules, is a product of multiplication more than inspiration. Start with the payload each vehicle can carry. It is modest in the language of steel mills and shipyards, but heavy enough to force care into every gesture. Gasoline in jerrycans sloshes with a frankly menacing weight. Artillery shells in crates sit like ciphers that turn into sentences only when fed to breeches. Rations have the boredom of routine and the brutality of necessity. Stack that payload evenly, and you get a number that could sit on a form without embarrassing anyone. Now, move to trips per day. The loop's one-way routing and disciplined pace squeeze an extra lap from a 24-hour period more often than a skeptic would predict. And that extra lap is where time found its advantage. When a forward dump shaves minutes from its unloading drill, it feeds that time back into the system, as if placing coins into a jar you swear you'll never need, and then you do, and they are there. Distance is a moderator of ambition. The longer the route, the fewer the laps, the more the burden falls on loading speed and empty return. The loop did not change geography, it changed what geography meant. By dictating pace, forbidding hesitation, and giving the road a social code enforced by MPs who refused to be bored into leniency, it turned miles into a known quantity. Drivers did not waste time tumbling into arguments at crossroads. Signs and hands made choices for them. That theft of indecision is a mathematical gift. Every avoided argument becomes a few seconds saved. A dozen avoided arguments become minutes. Multiply by hundreds of trucks and a day's worth of iterations, and you begin to see how small civilities became tons. Maintenance is subtraction kept under control. Every breakdown is a negative number threatening to crawl across the page until it drags a column of positives down with it. Mechanics and cannibalization crews worked like mathematicians with erasers, limiting the reach of each minus sign. They kept lists of likely failures and prepositioned remedies. They learned the hour of the night when certain parts were most likely to give up and kept themselves awake for it. When they could not save a truck, they saved its essence, handing its healthy parts to other vehicles, as if distributing inheritance while the patient's body was still warm. The loop's arithmetic absorbed these losses by assuming they would happen and planning around them, the way a merchant writes off a certain percentage of stock and survives anyway because turnover pays the rent. Dispatch is the art of aligning waves. Trucks leave in groups timed to prevent clots. Bridges are met when they can bear the weight, and return flows are treated with as much respect as outward thrusts because an empty truck is not useless. It is the promise of a quick next load. Forward dumps do their part by smoothing their own intake so that arrivals do not stack into a miserable sculpture of frustration visible from a mile out. Each of these choices is a match struck in a dark room, small and brief, until you see that 100 matches burning in sequence can light a hall. The math depends on this synchronization. When it clicks, You feel it in the voice of a dispatcher who starts to speak in whole sentences rather than fragments, because the day is no longer a crisis lived in gestures, but a plan kept in time. The numbers that matter most are not the spectacular sums that survive in commemorations. They are the hourly rates whispered in a foreman's ear at 3 in the morning and the turnaround times muttered like prayers. A depot supervisor who discovers that his team can consistently load a truck in 10 minutes less than last week's average has achieved more for the front than any speech will admit. A forward dump officer who learns to clear a queue without letting his men fall into the chaos of haste has given back to the loop a calm that can be converted into speed without losing sanity. In both cases, the arithmetic is personal. It lives in the bodies of men who are tired and yet insist that today will be a little cleaner, a little sharper than yesterday. What does this add up to at the front? It adds up to mornings that begin with engines already warm. It adds up to commanders who take the kind of risks that pay when ammunition stocks are burly and petrol bozers are confident. It adds up to the capacity to exploit a breach with enough insistence that the enemy's attempt to reset a line fails by a handful of hours that can be traced, if you care to follow the thread, back to a depot where night shift found a way to keep the coffee from tasting burnt, and an MP who kept a hot temper in his pocket when a flustered driver tried to jump the line. This is what is meant by calling the math a miracle. It is not that it defies explanation. It is that the explanation is so beautifully ordinary that we are tempted to look away from it in search of brighter words. If there is a single equation that feels truer than the rest, it is the compounding effect of time saved. Save a minute at the loading dock and you do not place a single minute into the bank. You allow a truck to arrive at a bridge before the repair team closes it again. You enable a convoy to pass a choke point before dusk turns the world into caution. You get a driver to a cot before his eyes turn sandy and his judgment goes soft. That minute becomes 3, becomes 5, becomes a mile, becomes a ridge taken in evening light instead of fog. At scales like this, the math behaves like weather. A small pressure difference here creates a storm system there. The trick is learning to feel the isobars. There is also the matter of discipline as a number. We do not speak of discipline this way, but we might. Every time a driver decides to obey the pace set by the convoy, he adds a fraction to the day's throughput by preventing a ripple that would waste fuel and attention. Every time an officer refuses a request that would send a truck on a vanity errand, he protects a block of time that will show up as ammunition where it needs to be. Every time a mechanic records a fault precisely rather than scribbling a guess, he feeds accuracy into a database that will, in some quiet office, prevent a shortage from maturing into a headline. Discipline is additive because it produces predictability, and predictability is the substrate on which tempo can be built without burning itself out. Finally, the math is generous to honesty. Reports that admit failure allow the system to correct itself. A forward dump that confesses it cannot handle another wave at 0300 may disappoint a commander, but it saves an entire set of trucks from idling into madness and wasting fuel the rest of the army cannot spare. A depot that admits a tire shortage in frank terms invites a redistribution that may bruise pride but keeps the loop breathing. In this way, truth itself becomes part of the arithmetic. Lies have a way of inflating numbers until they burst at the front. The Red Ball Express did not have time for illusions. It had time for trucks, for men, and for the ordinary heroism of meeting a schedule that did not care how tired you were. When the numbers finally sang, they sang because so many individual notes were held without flourish, clean and on pitch, until the music carried columns of steel across a country still echoing with broken rails and promises kept. Comfortable stories bloom whenever a system works too well to be glamorous. The first said that a single battlefield celebrity built a private highway and that every truck existed to burnish his legend. The appeal is obvious. One name, one road, one miracle. But the priority loop was built to answer theatre problems, not personal ones. It drew on coastal depots, dispatchers who thought in waves, military police enforcing one-way discipline, and forward dumps that converted crates into the next morning's options. It lived in forms, maps with grease pencil arcs, and rules that turned crossroads into decisions already made. A machine that large cannot belong to a single ego. It belongs to a plan. Another tale stretched the highway's lifespan until it became a permanent monument. Memory prefers arcs that do not fray. In truth, the loop burned bright for weeks, then yielded gracefully as repaired bridges, restored rail lines, and extending pipelines took back the load they were born to carry. The trucks did not disappear. They resumed quieter work. The virtue of the loop lay in its temporariness. It was a hinge. It opened when distance outgrew rail, and closed when steel wheels and pumping stations could carry the weight with less blood and fewer tires. A third claim promised that aircraft had rendered roads obsolete, that cargo would now fly as thought flies. Airlift was priceless for time-critical needles and saved days. But gasoline weighs what it weighs, and artillery eats as it must. The sky could deliver scalpel strokes. The road performed digestion. The loop's one-way lanes and relentless turnarounds moved the daily mass that makes operations breathe, and air power, magnificent as it was, never tried to pretend it could substitute for the stomach of a campaign. There was also the rumor that a few ambushes nearly strangled the system, and that luck, not design, preserved it. No one who drove the night lanes believed the roads were safe. Convoys burned, bridges fell, mines rewrote maps. Yet the loop was built to deny single points of failure. Parallel returns, disciplined spacing, daylight detours, and maintenance that budgeted for breakdowns made disaster a bruise, not a broken bone. The system bent often because bending was part of how it stayed alive. The last myth demoted the drivers to interchangeable labor. Spend one turn at a relay, and the slander dissolves. The men who steered learned the road's moods the way a violinist learns a piece, until fingers remember what the mind forgets. They taught newcomers how wet tar lies to your eyes, how bridges speak through the wheel, how an MP's wrist can compress a paragraph into a gesture. Their skill knitted the paper plan to the ground. Without those hands, the loop would have been noise. Myths persist because they flatter preference. They propose that outcomes are personal, permanent, technical, or accidental. The record on the road says otherwise. It says a temporary highway turned industrial depth into operational hours, then stepped aside. That air and road were partners with different appetites. That resilience was engineered before it was tested, and that human attention, dispensed 1,000 times a day by men with tired eyes, turned intention into miles. That is what happened. The country did not intend to help. Hedges soaked electrics, stones bruised tires, and bridges sighed under new demands. When rain came, it arrived like memory and turned verges to traps. None of this was a surprise. Friction was priced in. Warehouses met it first. Paper plans touched pallets with ambiguous stencils and crates that had shifted just enough to complicate a loader's grip. Supervisors traded 5 minutes of breath for 50 of pace, and crews trusted that bargain. At the ramp, loaders moved with a choreography that changed by the hour, but always had the same refrain. Get the weight balanced, get the canvas tight, get the wheels rolling. On the road, physics negotiated with temperament. A convoy is a social contract enforced by momentum. Too close, and you ripple panic. Too far, and you invite a dangerous seam. Military police did more than wave hands. They conducted moods. A calm gesture steadied men whose judgment had thinned. When firm voices were required, they arrived in single sentences that did not humiliate. This emotional governance kept small irritations from maturing into chaos. Breakdowns came in flocks. A spate of tire failures meant there was a knife hiding in the roadbed. Men walked with torches and found a seam of cruel gravel or a scatter of abandoned nails. Axles were answered with cannibalization that turned back lots into organ banks. Mechanics wrote their liturgy in torque values and grease and practiced triage like surgeons. To the untrained eye, a field of deadlined trucks looked like defeat. To the system, it was a reservoir. Every donor gave a little life to 5 others, and the convoy left at dawn because last night's sacrifice had been made without self-pity. Fatigue threatened from inside the cab. Attention wavered, shortcuts tempted. Culture, more than orders, supplied the counterweight. There was always a kettle near a ramp, always a cot tucked behind a stack of ration boxes, always permission to admit that your eyes had turned to sand. Commanders learned that the most efficient reprimand was often a nudge towards sleep. Men trusted schedules with mercy. In return, they gave back pace that could be relied upon. Weather argued each day. Fog narrowed the world to a tunnel and demanded faith in cat's eye reflectors. Heat made impatience the fourth passenger. Mud remembered every tire. Solutions were intentionally small, more reflectors on posts, gravel carried by hand to the worst ruts, canvas retentioned until loads behaved, and 1,000 small checks that seemed fussy until you counted the hours they saved. Security patrols mapped likely ambush points. Friction also lived in conversation. Forward dumps could not please everyone. The art was to explain the no in a way that preserved the larger yes. Units that presented need in terms of the day's priorities found doors opening faster than those who shouted. The loop survived because argument rarely became quarrel. Each bottleneck was treated as grammar rather than crisis, a comma in a sentence that still read forward. By night's end, the proof that this art worked was simple. Engines idled in lines heading toward dawn, and the day began with movement rather than apology. Strategy is a ledger kept in hours. The priority loop mattered because it shifted hours from contemplation to exploitation. A crossing achieved at dusk instead of midday creates a different reality for defenders. Fuel that arrives in time for a second lunge turns a successful check into a retreat. Ammunition landing at dawn writes courage into orders. The road converted industry into time that could be spent where imagination and nerve paid a dividend. Momentum was the first dividend. Pursuit after breakout is fragile. Prudence waits to reclaim it. By denying scarcity the chance to dictate tempo, the loop kept commanders in the mood to exploit. Bridges seized on hunches, stayed seized, because the guns behind them did not fall silent. Villages that might have hosted pauses became stepping stones. The theatre's temperature rose as weeks passed with fewer hunger days. Plans drafted at noon survived the night because staff officers trusted the morning's deliveries to match the page they had written. Option value was the second dividend. A force that can feed more than one axis preserves freedom of choice. Ambiguity is a weapon. It compels the opponent to defend widely and dilutes his talent for counterstroke. The loop did not abolish trade-offs, but it softened them. It raised the floor under every day so that decisions were not made in panic. When a commander threatened 2 doors at once, some opened on their own. Morale was the third dividend, and it ran both directions. Units that ate and fired on schedule believed themselves backed by competence. That belief survived first contact more often than rhetoric does. The men who loaded, drove, and enforced felt the echo. Requests arrived with the tone that says trust lives here. Pride took root in unglamorous corners. An army that believes in its own supply learns to be ambitious without becoming reckless. The final dividend was temporal. The road bought weeks for rail lines and pipelines to heal. Those are the arteries that sustain a long war, and they require time measured in crews and rivets and valves. Every night run that delivered fuel prevented a pause framed as prudence. Every day of punctual ammunition spared engineers from being robbed to solve a crisis. The highway purchased the quiet in which heavier machinery could be restored. When steel wheels began to sing again, and pumps pushed inland, the loop stepped back without resentment, because stepping back had always been part of the design. The season left an idea behind. It demonstrated that logistics could be agile without dissolving into improvisation for its own sake. That discipline enables speed, that small improvements multiplied patiently beat grand promises made loudly. Long after the signs faded, planners remembered that a road made from rules and attention can bend the shape of a campaign. They remembered that an army wins not only when it fights better, but when it refuses to run out of mourning. The signs came down without speeches. What had been guarded like a border reverted to ordinary roads, and the white gloves that once ruled intersections found other work. Warehouses folded their special rhythms into the broader cadence of a theatre returning to rails and pipelines. The silence was appropriate. Things that succeed by being temporary should leave gently. What remains is simple enough to say and hard enough to forget. The road loop existed for a slice of time when victory depended on converting piles of cans and crates into momentum faster than the opponent could rebuild his line. It did so by inventing a highway out of rules, by disciplining impatience into pace, and by turning thousands of small, honest efforts into a daily guarantee. It ended when stronger arteries healed. Between those points, it shrank the map and made audacity reasonable. The men who made it real did not ask for poetry. They asked for hot food, spare parts, clear orders, and the respect that keeps tired people precise. They drove into fog and through heat and back again into darkness, and they learned that boredom endured with care can be as decisive as courage displayed with a flourish. Many returned to quieter duties, carrying the plain pride of people who kept a promise. Some did not return at all. The road keeps its own memorials, marked in places where tires failed or bridges broke or night hid something a moment too long. Across the line, the lesson landed with the weight of fact. An opponent who had been trained to hunt overreach discovered an enemy that refused to oblige. Logistics behaved like a weapon without becoming a boast. Resilience was a choice, repeated until it hardened into habit. In the grand ledger of the war, these are not marginal notes. They are the entries that explain why some opportunities closed before they could be exploited. Endings need images. Imagine a dawn when mist lifts from a stretch of macadam that no longer holds special privilege. A single truck moves at an ordinary pace, carrying sacks of flour to a town where ovens are lighting again. On a verge stands a splintered post, a faint circle still visible where paint once ordered obedience. The driver does not slow. He breathes in, shifts up, and continues, because the point was always to keep going. The road has returned to being a road. The work has become memory, and that is enough.